Hello everyone and welcome to Octatrack tutorial of the week. So today I'm going to talk about arrangement mode because I've just learned how to use it and it's fresh in my memory, so I'm going to get right into it. I wasn't going to do this and I've avoided it for a long time, as I think many Octatrack users have, just because it doesn't really, it's not something that I'm that interested in because it feels kind of like creating basically like an arrangement that's harder to read than, using a timeline in Ableton or Logic or something. But I got inspired because I went to the Loop Festival a few weeks ago, and Kalela talked about her performance setup where she has all of the tracks laid out, and then her mixing guy basically just does effects on it while she's performing. So my performance, I'm actually playing a show in like a week or so I decided to learn how to use arrangement mode so that I could be prepared for this. All right, so the easiest way for me to explain this is to use the arrangement that I've already designed, because it has a lot of parts, and just bear with me here because I know it looks very complicated, but I'll try to explain everything as concisely as possible. So over on the far left column, you have a numbered list, which is basically just telling you where in the list you are. And essentially, the arrangement is just going to play each event for as long as you tell it to. And how do you tell it how long to play? Well, let's start by talking about the column right to the right of this. And this is basically telling you what pattern and what bank to be playing. The banks are lettered and the patterns are numbered. So this is telling me that bank A16, pattern 16, is going to play for 5 repetitions. So this is where you can adjust how many times it plays through the pattern. And then this can actually tell you exactly what part of the pattern to play. And this is really powerful because if I have a 64-step pattern, I can actually tell it to start on the 9, for example, repeat to the 34th step, and do that 5 times. So this pattern length is considered before the repetitions are. So let's reset that to 0. Cool. So on the right here, you can choose what scenes it defaults to. So I know that if you have a part set up so that certain scenes are assigned, say your pattern 1 is assigned to part 1, and scenes A and B are like 1 and 2 respectively, you can actually override that and tell it to actually set scene A to 2 and B to 10. And that's really cool because you can actually, if I have something that's looping a lot, I can actually re-trigger this scene, tell it to play, twice this way with this particular scene configuration, and then play twice this way with a different scene configuration. And that allows me to play a lot with a single pattern and not have to worry about when I'm going to be adjusting the scenes myself. I don't have to do it manually anymore. What is this? MIDI transposing. So I believe this allows you to so this lets you transpose every track in your MIDI, depending on where your pattern is. So, I mean, that's extremely powerful too. I'm not much of a MIDI guy when it comes to Octatrack yet, but this is super powerful if you're trying to change keys and you don't want to fuss with any other kinds of like manual MIDI. I know it's really complicated to go into the MIDI menu and then like go over to the transport section of the ARP and adjust it yourself. So this kind of fixes all that. This part is one of the most powerful parts to me, which is after you have the scene, after you have the transpose section, you also have a beat section, which allows you to set the tempo of this particular step in the arrangement. And so if you have, like I do, a bunch of songs that are at different tempos, I can basically just tell it exactly what tempo to switch to. And this is the only way that you can tell the Octatrack to change tempos. There are no trig settings that allow you to do this. So if you want to change tempos without doing it manually, this is all you got. Here is a mute section, which is pretty interesting, but I think it's also important to clarify that it's not actually going to mute your track the same way that you're familiar with. So, for example, if I trigger a scene and it has all of these muted, they're not going to look like they're muted and then I can unmute them with this button. They're actually just not going to trigger at all. So don't treat them as though they're playing in the background. They just haven't been triggered at all. Let's see, what else about the basics? Yeah, so essentially, if we read this a little bit, what I'm telling it to do is to say, let's start with this one actually. So I'm telling this track to play 18 times at 64 steps. I'm telling scenes A and B to be 2 and 3. And I'm telling the tempo to be 96. After 18 repetitions of this pattern, it's going to switch to Mk2 because all of my songs are separated into banks. I have this set up so that there are one-shot trigs on all of my stems. And so that means that after these 4 bars repeat, nothing's actually getting triggered. But instead, I'm telling the Octatrack to continue allowing this pattern to play these particular stems until 18 repetitions of the 4-bar pattern. And once that's done, I know that that's the end of the song because I measured it out in Ableton. And once that song is over, it'll transition directly into song 2, which I can trigger here. And you can hear that the tempo is slightly different. And this one will play for 26 repetitions of a 4-bar pattern because, like before, I've already measured it out in Ableton. And I highly recommend doing this if this is the particular thing you're trying to do. Playing tracks is very much doable on the Octatrack, but it's a lot easier to know exactly how long your song is going to be so that when you transition, it's seamless. And then following that, I have song 3 on bank 3. The thing about this one is that it's not actually triggering any audio. I believe it's triggering MIDI. Yeah, okay. So this is a good time to explain the loop function. So the way you set up a loop function is, let me turn this down a little bit, is there's a few different settings in here that you can use. So aside from the just choosing the banks manually, there's also a halt function. And this basically tells the Octatrack to do a number of things. It's defaulted to halt, but if you change the number, it'll actually allow you to use this step to jump to another scene. So for example, I could actually have it jump to number 9, which is all the way down here, and play that instead. But if I go before that, you'll notice that it switches to loop. And that's because if you go back to a previous scene, or sorry, I shouldn't call them scenes, a previous row, it'll start back up, and then once it hits loop, it'll start over again. Infinitely, unless you just designate exactly how many times it does that. So this is a pretty cool way to create a loop within your arrangement so that you're not necessarily completely on rails. And that's kind of what I've done here. Let me just delete this one. Basically, what this is telling me to do is, after I've reached number 4, I want to loop number 4 an infinite number of times. And so once I go into this arrangement mode, which you hit function arrange to show in your main menu, I can navigate to different scenes. I can go backwards. But once I get to number 4, right. So once I get to number 4, it's just going to loop indefinitely until I tell it to go to number 6. And it'll snap to the end of the pattern. And then from that point on, I have the arrangement continue on until I reach the next loop point. There's a few other things you can do within arrangement mode that I should cover. Let me see here. So aside from halt, which allows you to stop the set basically right where it is. That's this. So this feature starts as halt, and that only applies if you're telling it the same number as the row that you're on. And that basically says stop the project right here. after which point you can navigate yourself down. So that's kind of like a point for you to pause in the set if you're trying to like say something, or if you want to like use live instruments. I don't know. And then it switches between loop and jump depending on which row you're telling it to go to. So aside from that, there's one more function that the row can serve, which is reminder. And all this does is it tells you something that you want to say. So you can just like, you could say something like switch to blah, blah, blah. Like, you know, if you have like some sort of an instrument thing that you want to put in there, or any kind of reminder. It's a little clunky, but I don't know. I guess it's kind of helpful. And that's just kind of a crash course on the whole arrangement system. That's really all I've been using. I don't really know if there's a ton more. There's chaining, which you can basically take different rows and chain them to each other so that they play one after another. You can reload your chain so that it goes back to your last save setting, the same way that you reload parts or banks, or audio pools. Sorry. You can rename your arrangement. But yeah, so this is kind of a good way to take a bunch of patterns that you've been playing with and turn them into a repeatable arrangement that isn't entirely dependent on your own input. So you can focus on effects. You can focus on maybe if you have a sampling sort of workflow that works for you, you could have, you know, a 4-bar loop that plays indefinitely until you have something that you like, and then switch to the next one. That's fairly similar to using patterns, but this just keeps it a little bit more on the rails so that you can focus on playing with scenes. Maybe you can have some interesting interaction between scene changes. One thing I will mention that I've come across in my particular case that's important to point out is that if you are launching one-shot scenes, as I am oftentimes in my project, be aware that changing scenes, even if you use parts to do this, this is a problem. Changing scenes will be kind of buggy. I don't know why, but I think it has to do with like trigs being the place where certain scenes are adjusted. So to clarify, basically, if I'm playing this particular pattern, and I tell it to switch between two scenes, but the track is not actually playing anything new because it's a one-shot trig, your scenes will stay on the previous setting, even though they look to you like they've switched scenes. They'll actually sound like nothing has changed. And I think that's because the Octatrack doesn't actually adjust scene changes until a trig is introduced. I think they do that because sonically it makes more sense to operate on scene triggers. Or sorry, I think it's because they feel like sonically speaking it makes more sense to trigger scene changes on actual trigs. But I've found it to be a pretty frustrating part, because there's a lot of times that I want to just tell it to switch scenes, and it doesn't actually do that very well if I'm using one-shot trigs. So just something to keep in mind. If anybody has any solutions to that particular problem, please comment below. But yeah, that's pretty much everything. So let me know if you have any questions, and have fun with the Octatrack. See you next week.